Gaywyck by Vincent Verga. Publisher Allison Books, Los Angeles, New York. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 6. When I awoke, a sunbeam probed between the drapes beyond the foot of the bed. I could hear waves breaking on the shore and smell the keen, quaint air. Cale slept against my right hip, and Brian sat reading beside the bed, his right hand covering mine. I felt rested and calm. I remembered much tossing and turning and a profound agitation in trying to escape from a clutch of nightmares. My mother's face, like a water lily, floated on the surface of memory and superimposed over every other image. I had awakened several times, not knowing where I was. Gentle hands had comforted me, bathing my forehead and feeding me, returning the blankets when I threw them off. Of these ministrations I was dimly aware when the tumultuous chaos lifted. Peaceful sleep descended for the first time in 7 days. "What are you reading, Brian?" Looking up at me, he laughed and showed me the spine of the book. "Wuthering Heights? I love that book. Poor Catherine and Heathcliff." He shook his head vehemently, anger in his eyes. "No, why not?" He opened the book to the frontispiece, depicting them embracing on the heath. Grimacing, he pointed to Heathcliff, placing the book on the bed face down. He raised his hands to form horns on his forehead. "But don't you think he suffers enough for that?" He shook his head furiously. He would have none of it. I began to argue for love. He put his fingers in his ears. When I closed my mouth, he placed his hand over it. I lay still. He smiled. I frowned. He nodded happily. "Your fever is gone." Danvers stood in the doorway. Brian made laughing, guttural sounds and trotted from the room. Cale woke, stretched, made his own guttural sounds, resembling a rumbling bird call, and jumped from the bed to follow my nurse. Never moralize with Brian on romantic obsession, my dear boy. You and I may agree with Dr. Johnson that he who makes a beast of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man. But Brian, for all his pain, would consider that a poor bargain. He's taking better care of you than of his precious bumblebees. I asked how long I'd been ill and was amazed at the reply. 3 days? He explained that I fell into a fever the first night, and the doctor had confirmed the fact that I was overstrained and suffering from nervous exhaustion. He had left detailed instructions and medicaments to be administered. While helping me to my bed, Brian had heard me call for Danough Gaylord and had refused to leave my side. He commandeered the sick room, following the doctor's orders precisely, ignoring all else, and demanding the household behave accordingly. "He's lived here with you. It seems you've made 3 friends. He's the most valuable of us all, trust me. Our kitchen is a commissary. We've eaten nothing that isn't journeying toward or fait accompli soup. You've no idea how pleased we are to see you well." While he spoke, he marched around the room, opening the drapes and the French windows, fluffing my pillows, and wagging his index finger at me like an angry tutor. "Don't scold him, Danvers, not even in jest." Danough Gaylord leaned on the doorframe, a crooked smile on his imperial face. He wore dark blue trousers and a maroon striped shirt, its collar unattached, open at the neck. Wind-blown hair fell over his brow. "If this is the result of his first meeting with you, I see you've lost none of your powers." "Once a Jesuit, my boy. Always a Jesuit. Though maybe I flatter you. I wonder if this wasn't a ruse to gain your sympathy and win Cale's and Brian's affections." "Whatever. He succeeded brilliantly. Not completely, however. He hasn't taken keys away from Beethoven." but they haven't yet met. There was a warmth and shared camaraderie in our laughter. I felt my heart expand. Brian returned with a bowl of steaming chicken soup, which he carefully placed on the bed table. Cale sprang onto the bed, his yellow eyes as round as asters. He paused, studying my face to ascertain a welcome, then carefully made his way to my hand, which he cleaned before settling beside me. His nose was wet and shockingly cold. Brian walked around the bed to the other hand to take my pulse. He entered some figures in a small green notebook after consulting the clock on the mantel. "Thank you, Brian," I said, grasping his hand. "I hear you saved me." He shook his head. Danough Gaylord crossed from the doorway to his side. Putting an arm around the boy's shoulder, he squeezed him affectionately. "Brian is the best, Robert. The finest. Do everything he tells you, and you'll never have to worry." Brian sounded a long, extended "ah," and rested his head on Danough Gaylord's shoulder. "How many more days in bed for me, Brian?" The boy held up 3 fingers. I moaned and asked if I could bathe before then. A brief conference ensued. Yes, if I did not dally in the water and if I finished my soup. Brian left to run a bath. I drank the broth. Denvers and Danough Gaylord, in conversation, walked out to the railing of the porch. I looked around me. The bed had an ash head and base, the same color as the walls and ceiling. The comforter and drapes were chocolate brown. An ornate radiator with a G crest rested like a piece of sculpture opposite the fireplace. Atop a Queen Anne bureau set my Lars and Peanuts. David Copperfield, a stone paperweight, a small wooden box with cuttings of my parents' hair, and an old brass ruler that had become a good luck charm. My journals were neatly piled on a small table in the corner to the right of the bed. A most exquisite Madonna hung on the wall. "Good Lord, a Cavelli!" "We know," called Danough Gaylord. "Don't you like her?" "Yes, of course, I like her. She startled me is all." "Then we'll leave it," he said to Denvers as they walked through the billowing drapes. "I can certainly think of more startling things to find in one's bedroom." "What's in your bedroom, Danvers?" I asked. "Only a Rubens, alas." Danough Gaylord laughed. "My parents were very fortunate when it came to buying pictures. They were very rich, which is far more important, Danough, and they took no chances. They lacked a sense of adventures, which you've more than compensated for, my boy. The thing in the other room is actually quite nice, by the way. Much more to my taste than the others done by those hyperactive bohemians. I've hung the Cezanne in your sitting room, Robert. He hates to admit it, but he likes it." "I don't hate to admit it. I admit it. I like it. But one is divinely vulgar. 2 would be impertinent. There's a Vermeer in my bedroom, Robert, and the Della Francesca in the small study is very special. Did you notice it on the wall opposite the mirror?" "Yes, he did. He saw it reflected in the mirror. It gave him quite a fright." I stared at Denvers, then glanced away. It wasn't the Della Francesca image that had frightened me. Danough Gaylord's voice broke in on my thoughts. "If the Crivelli excites you, we must administer a sedative before allowing you downstairs." Trying to be cheerful, I told them I was eager to see Cellini's obscene satyr in the sunroom. Denver snorted. "That twit Ambrose will never learn. Those luscious fellows remind us that all good things come in pairs." "Denvers, you always forbade us to generalize. Surely not all good things. There must be an exception. And who, Didymus, knows that better than I?" The tutor raised his mutilated limb to emphasize his point. The weight of the gesture was lost on me, but not on Danough Gaylord. Having one moment been so carefree and jocular, he suddenly stood pale and drawn. Brian pulled back my blankets. When I tried to stand, I discovered the debilitating effects of my illness. I rested on the edge of the bed, and the two men had moved back to the portico. Danvers was speaking animatedly to Danough Gaylord, obviously distressed, head bowed. He looked very young, beside the gray-haired man nearly as young as I. And Brian caught his attention. He carried me to the tiled bathroom, where a frothy white tub awaited. "Brian loves bathing powders," he said softly. I removed my nightshirt and, with their assistance, stepped into the bath. After standing for a few moments to prepare myself for the water, I knelt slowly into the herbal-scented foam, viewed over my shoulder. Danough Gaylord stood, frowning, lost in thought. Danvers studied him intensely. Their eyes met and locked for an instant until the flustered young man excused himself and walked from the room. I was allowed to soak for 3 minutes. Brian washed me using a coarse cloth that was surprisingly invigorating. Normally, I would have been self-conscious and ill at ease, being seen naked and being assisted, but it happened so quickly and matter-of-factly that I had no time to reflect on anything but the pleasures of the bath. Stepping from the tub, I was wrapped in a thick brown towel and rubbed dry, then helped into an emerald green flannel nightgown that Denver said had once belonged to the twins. When they were 10 years old, no doubt, I thought, looking at my small, taunt face reflected in the steamy mirror. I noticed a brown leather case on the sink stand beside my old brush. "What's that?" "It's for you. Brushes and some toilet things." I opened it. The light danced on silver and gold manicure pieces and china-backed combs and brushes and tiny crystal bottles filled with colored liquids. The first one I unstopped contained the scent I recognized instantly as Danough Gaylord's. I felt him standing close again. "Thank you for being so kind, sir, and so patient with me." "Mr. Whyte, I am neither kind nor patient." "Enjoy them, Robert. Use them well." "Thank you, Danvers. Whose were they?" "No one's. Mrs. Gaylord loved Fabergé pieces. We were the New York branch of his business." Back in the bed, wrapped in clean linen, I was served hot chocolate and fruit. It was time for my nap, a fact Brian made clear by closing the windows, drawing the drapes, removing the extra pillows, and tucking the blankets over my head. Seizing the moment when Brian went to fill my water jug, Danvers sat by my side and spoke very softly. "I don't know how much you remember." "All of it. I remember all of it. I saw my mother in the mirror." "Robert, you were greatly fatigued from the journey and from your experiences with her illness. What you saw was the Della Francesca lit by Ambrose's lamp. But do you recall his entering the room?" I thought back and realized his simple explanation was most likely the correct one. He observed the relief on my face. Rising to leave, he said, "I'm pleased we've settled that. Now go to sleep." "Yes," I said. Yes, I will." There's no other explanation, I thought, unless I've gone mad. Please, God, don't let me be mad. Alone with the cat, I arranged my body around his in the wonderfully comfortable bed. Was ever there a pair as fortunate as we? I whispered to Kel. He opened his eyes a slit, yawned, stretched his back legs, and began purring, enveloped in a sense of well-being. I slept soundly. Kale's purr became the loveliest of lullabies. Brian woke me. He opened the drapes and propped me up with pillows before ceremoniously presenting an overloaded tea tray. I recognized the smell of spice cake, but there was none in front of me. Scanning the room, I spotted a linen-wrapped mound on top of my journals. After silently devouring a large portion of fluffy, soft scrambled eggs, I smiled at him and awaited the inevitable. He removed the empty dishes, then fetched and unveiled the cake, which he placed on the tray. Tense and anxious, he paced the room. I poured a cup of tea, sweetened it with honey. "Is this from your hives?" He nodded. "It's wonderful." He nodded. I cut the cake. He gazed out the window, suddenly interested in clouds. Fortunately, his spice cake was ambrosia. Delighted, I told him truthfully that it was the best, the most nutritious dessert. He turned and studied me, flushed with unalloyed pleasure. "It's my secret recipe," he whispered. Startled, I sat very still, the second morsel of cake balanced on my fork, halfway between plate and mouth. Brian had spoken. He hadn't spoken in clearly formed syllables, but rather in a modulated hum that I understood perfectly. I wanted to shout and tell him how wonderful it was that he was not a mute. Instead, I said calmly, "Who gave you the recipe?" "Monsieur Henry. But I've changed it almost completely." "Has he tasted it?" He nodded. "Did he like it?" "He asked for the recipe, but I wouldn't give it to him." We laughed as though it were the most wonderful joke in the world. We talked together while I finished my tea. He asked me how I'd met Danough Gaylord. I told him how I came to Gaywyck, and I told him about my mother's face in the mirror. I also told him that I was afraid of going mad as my mother had done. He assured me I was no longer to worry, because if I did, Danough would take good care of me. "Thanks," I said. "There's some comfort in that. Not much, but some. Some is better than none." Yeah. Before he left, I took the last of the prescribed sedative. Unaccustomed to drugs, I was frightened by the force with which sleep overtook me, and I could remember during the previous 3 days losing the sense of demarcation between waking and sleepy reality. I complained that hurtling into sleep terrified me and probably did to my brain what Alice's drink me potion had done to her body. But I swallowed the medicine. Instantly, I was spun into a tumultuous dream. A searing warmth filled me, fusing images and causing a buzzing sensation in my ears that woke me into a night room, loud with the carping of cicadas and the singing of whippoorwills. A sibilant whispering occurred. I had been dreaming of the sea. The voice at first surfaced from its depth beneath the horizon. I grasped fragments of sentences as though they rode the great distance on the crests of waves, like slivers of moonlight surrendering to the pull of the drug. I tumbled backward into the self's darkest reaches. The voice persisted. I struggled again, answering its summons, until, quivering with recognition, I imagined it Danough Gaylord's. Totally numb, I opened my eyes. Cold air chilled me. I shivered and groped for the receding waves. He laughed an echoing laugh. Sitting on my bed, he took me in his arms, tugging on my nightshirt. He deftly pulled it over my head. "You smell lovely," he whispered. Kind and patient, I thought. He pressed me back to the pillows. I lay curled in the gelid hollow of a wave. He caught it. I tumbled upward, opening. He hovered, naked, poised above, until I pulled him down. The heat of him and bright lights blinded. His hair was wet and smelled of the sea. He grasped me tightly, murmuring, "Yes." I slept in his enveloping arms beneath a heaving sea. The wind rustled the drapes, moving them sufficiently for me to see that the French windows were open. My visitor, fully clothed, stood to the left, staring out at the night. Unsteadily, I rose from the bed. My body ached, and I had great difficulty standing. My mouth tasted salty. As I approached him, he turned, catching me before I fell. "Go back to bed." "I want to be with you, Danough." Angrily, he pulled away. Stepping out, he vanished. "Go back to bed," I said, hung in the air. I followed him, but he was nowhere to be seen. Staring at the moonlight sea, I shivered drowsily, then looked around. I was straining against a railing on a second-story balcony, automatically walking to the right. I reached a balustrade. Leaning over, I discovered myself outside the oval window. I could see Cale sitting on the landing across the egg-shaped window. The balcony continued, but the gap made by the glass was too vast for me to leap across. Glancing upward, I discerned that what I had construed as roof was actually a similar balcony for the third floor. Turning, I saw a stairway at the end connecting it with mine. Perhaps the similar stairs descended to the ground below? Supporting myself on the railing, I moved in that direction. I was freezing cold and dizzy from the shock of it. I spotted him, walking the border of trees that edges the lawn at the rise. Quickening his pace, he glanced over his shoulder as though looking for me. I raised my arms. He stopped. Our eyes met, telescoping the yards between eradicating distance. A strange smile broke upon his face, a smile filled with pain and bewilderment. Raising his right arm, he tapped it to his forehead in salute. Turning away, he hurriedly walked in the direction of the sea. I wanted to be with him. Descending the steps, I stumbled after. He sat on the rise between two great yews, contemplating the sea. When he heard me approach, he spun around stupefied. He muttered my name. Standing, he quickly removed his jacket to cover my nakedness. "Good Lord, Robert! I only wanted—" Before I could explain, I collapsed. He carried me back to the house. Once in my room, he set me on the bed and, taking his jacket from me, replaced my nightshirt as gently as he had removed it. Why this sudden modesty? I began to shiver violently. "Have you always walked in your sleep?" he asked. He piled blankets on me, then built a fire. "You've probably caught your death. Brian told us you were sleeping soundly." "I was, until you woke me." He stared at me for an instant, frowning. He turned away. "You were dreaming." Bewildered, I felt compelled to contradict. I was certain I had not been dreaming. The face in the mirror may have been the product of an overwrought imagination, but his presence and his warmth most certainly were not. "I was not dreaming. I was not." "Stay still, for God's sake," he shouted. "I'll get you something hot to drink." He left me alone, upset and gradually overtaken by fear and shame at having spoken to him in so bold a manner. I began to whimper and shiver uncontrollably. The door opened. Cale entered, followed by Brian. The cat jumped on my bed, sniffed my face, and gently, softly touched his cold nose to my cheek, bestowing a kiss, the first he'd ever given me. "What happened?" Brian queried groggily. I shrugged, fighting back tears, unable to answer him. Danough Gaylord crossed toward me. "Drink this." I obeyed the stern, low-voiced command without hesitation. The drink was very hot, and there was whiskey in it. It warmed me quickly. "You must try to sleep, Robert. I'll send for the doctor immediately." "I don't need a doctor." He raised his right eyebrow. "No more sedatives?" Brian interjected nervously, attempting a joke. "Exactly. Now go to sleep, Robert." "Brian's bedded in your sitting room. He's been there all night with the connecting door open. If you need anything, call him." The tone of his voice made it clear there was to be no more conversation. Suddenly, I was terribly confused and uncontrollably tired. A chill shook me. The thought of his anger terrified me. "Brian, please fetch Robert an aspirin powder before you go to bed." My young friend left us. Danough Gaylord smiled at me as if in forgiveness. I forced myself to smile in return. He put his hand on my forehead and brushed back my hair. My eyes collected tears. My heart responded. Gratitude pervaded me, submerging reason in the mysterious comfort I drew from him. "Forgive me," I mumbled. "There's nothing to forgive." I should have been more careful. I should have put Brian in the room here with you to protect you. In time, you'll be fine. Oh, Mr. Danough. Brian brought the aspirin powder. Go to sleep now, Robert. Brian, go to bed. You're exhausted, and we mustn't have you coming down with something. I watched them walk to the door. Danough paused while Brian continued out of the room. Turning to me, he smiled again, and then quickly raised his right hand to his forehead in a salute, similar to the one he had just given me from the garden. The gesture surprised me, but before I could comment, he was gone. Could I have imagined that? I could see him standing in the garden, but I could also see him standing at his Gramercy Park window with the curtains pushed aside. He was waving to me, or was he saluting? No longer certain, I meekly acknowledged it. It was always the more ceremonial courtesy. I was dreaming. Must have been. From whence come such bewildered dreams as these? Dimly awake, I felt Cales make his careful way to my pillow. Curling himself, he pressed against the top of my head, purring heavily. I felt protected, guarded. Together we journeyed by Corkle. He knew the constellations well. For a time, we wore armor, but I alone jousted with Gaywyck Gaylord, who was also a shimmering sea in a grove of golden geckos. I held out my hands to catch the fan-like leaves that spiraled to the earth, but they burned me. We bathed in chilling waves. One by one, they donned helmets of steel. In a castle lived a cyclops with a clouder of cats. The chill took its toll. I awoke with a heavy cold. Since I'd earned it, I made no complaints, but stayed quietly abed, eating and drinking all the food put in front of me. The cold did not linger. 2 days elapsed without incident, but without a visit from Danough Gaylord. On the third day, I asked Danvers about my employer. He left for town yesterday. An urgent business. I was stunned. Why should I have expected otherwise? Will he be back soon? I ventured. I should think so. In any case, not before Thanksgiving. Although unable to completely conceal my disappointment, I managed to mask the extent of it, even from myself. Danvers abruptly changed the subject to the book he held in his hands. Have you read much, Whitman? I shook my head, then added, only a few pieces in magazines. Why didn't he say goodbye, I wondered, knowing full well he had more important things to do than visit with me, an employee. Read him now, dear boy, and learn something. Danvers handed me the volume. It's the 1881 edition, he explained, sitting by my side. I wanted the complete 1892 edition, but as usual, I couldn't find it. Nor could I locate the 1888 November Bows and Sands of 70 and Goodbye May Fancy. It is so frustrating. One could never find a goddamn thing, and I was convinced I knew where they were, which makes it even more irritating. We all await your ordering our books. How did you find this edition? It was on Danough's desk. That's what set me thinking about Whitman. I'll be very happy to see that 1860 edition. It's inscribed. One of my favorite volumes. Things have a way of vanishing in this house. They turn up again, surely. Eventually. While one is searching for something else. Years skitter by that way. He asked if I had decided upon a strategy. I said I hadn't given it much thought. He assured me I was not to feel pressured. He suggested I rest a few more days. Then left me to Whitman. The book had been resting on my lap. When I placed it on its spine, it opened to a marked page. I read the poem in front of me. When I heard at the close of day. When I heard at the close of day how my name had been received with plaudits in the capital, still it was not a happy night for me that followed. And else when I caroused, or when my plans were accomplished, Still, I was not happy. But the day when I rose at dawn from the bed of perfect health, refreshed, singing, inhaling the ripe breath of autumn, when I saw the full moon in the west grow pale and disappear in the morning light, when I wandered alone over the beach and undressed, bathed, laughing with the cold waters, and saw the sun rise, and when I thought how my dear friend, my lover, was on his way, coming, oh, then I was happy. Oh, then each breath tasted sweeter, and all that day my food nourished me more, and the beautiful day passed. Well, and the next came with equal joy, and with the next, at evening, came my friend. And that night, while all was still, I heard the waters roll slowly, continually, up the shores. I heard the hissing rustle of the liquid in sands as directed to me, whispering to congratulate me, for the one I loved most lay sleeping by me under the same cover. In the cool night, in the stillness, in the autumn moonbeams, his face was inclined toward me, and his arm lay lightly around my breast, and that night I was happy. My heart raced ahead of me. The poem's sentiments agitated me. The words sang of love. I reread them, anticipating the rush of emotion. The phrases rooted in my memory. I closed the book. Was the marker inserted for my benefit? Dare I presume Danough Gaylord meant me to see it? That he was speaking to me? I felt joy rising. I fought against seizing it. It was beyond my ken, and I, with my tightly governed spirit, buttressed to preserve order, harmony, and uniformity of feeling, could surrender so easily to the chaos, the anarchy, the deranged regions of emotions. Nature must truly abhor solitude. To calm myself, I turned to the beginning of the Calamus group. Every poem aroused me. By the love of comrades, by the manly love of comrades, the dear love of man for his comrade, the attraction of friend for friend. Then I was gazing again upon the poem beneath the marker. The exhilaratingly beautiful verse moved me to tears. Surely we had all become comrades. Why else had Danvers acted as messenger? Blissfully I charged into the next poem with 9 lines. I was devastatingly routed. Are you the new person drawn toward me? Are you the new person drawn toward me? To begin with, take warning. I am surely far different from what you suppose. Do you suppose you will find me your ideal? Do you think it's so easy to have me become your lover? Do you think the friendship of me would be unalloyed satisfaction? Do you think I am trusty and faithful? Do you see no further than the facade, this smooth and tolerant manner of me? Do you suppose yourself advancing on real ground toward a real heroic man? Have you no thought or dreamer that it may all be a Maya illusion? The shock of truth was more than I could physically bear. I could not catch my breath. Having lowered my defenses, I now sat helpless and trembling at the cruel, crushing onslaught. The message was not loving tidings, but one of admonition, a caution, a warning. I caught my breath. It seared my breast. I was overwhelmed by the shame of having made this indirect means of communication necessary. Obviously, I had evinced signs of instability, and no other approach seemed feasible. The succinct Whitman statement left no room for doubt. Tears dropped on the page, punctuating the poem anew. I cried myself to sleep. I slept suddenly. I slept soullessly. I slept to overcome a death of the spirit, a death of the heart. When I awoke, Dr. Anders was standing beside my bed. After his examination, he declared me a fine specimen and suggested one more day convalescent, then business as usual. Just what the doctor ordered, I thought. A return to the old sensible life of effort. Denver's found me in good spirits. Did you manage any Whitman? Oh, yes. More than enough. He's a great poet. Thank you. You're welcome. But I really did very little. It was Danough who put the poem before me and Whitman who wrote them. But you were the emissary. I thought of sacrificing the messenger who embodied bad tidings in an attempt to controvert their ill effects. That image of Denver's being flung from the balcony into the sea careened through my mind. Emissary? You're a strange young man, Robert. Emissary, indeed. I studied his face. He accepted my scrutiny. Yes, Robert, I suppose emissary is an appropriate word if one thinks about it. I nodded. He smiled and left the room, stroking Cale. I reopened the book and reread the poems. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.